Welcome back. A Fox News alert for you. In the most violent day of anti-government protest in Iran, at least 12 people were killed when armed demonstrators tried to take control of police stations yesterday, and then they were forced back by security officers. That is according to Iran's state media. This is the largest public display of resistance since the so-called Green Movement of 2009. Connor Powell is following the story live for us from our Jerusalem bureau. Connor, how have authorities responded to these protests?
Yeah, Heather, protesters continue to defy Iranian authorities, taking to the streets of Tehran and across the country for the fifth straight day. Now, unlike in 2009 during the Green Revolution, where the protests were centered in Tehran and millions of people took to the streets, these protests have been scattered across the entire country and smaller in size. They're far more diverse across the entire country than in the last time there were these large-scale protests. The current president, Hassan Rouhani, a moderate in the Iranian political system, has said that the violence will not be tolerated, but he's also acknowledged that Iranians have a right to protest and that there are legitimate grievances about the current state of affairs in Iran. Still, Iran's government has blocked access to the internet and some social media networks like Instagram and Telegram and this weekend, and hundreds of people have been arrested, including at least 12 people who have been killed. Now, given Iran's authoritarian history and the oppressive regime, it's unlikely that these protests will continue, Heather, without further repressive regime tactics against these protesters.
You know, President Trump has issued tweets. We've been reading those statements in support of the Iranian protesters. While most other U.S. allies, they've remained silent. Any word as to why that's happening?
Yeah, Heather, President Trump and other members of his administration, including UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, have really responded with strong supportive statements and tweets in support of the protesters, while European leaders like Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron have stayed pretty silent, similar to what we saw out of the Obama administration during the Green Revolution back in 2009. But there are divided views about whether or not this support by President Trump will help the protesters or hurt them. Hardliners in Iran have already tried to paint hardliners in Iran have already tried to paint protesters as paid agitators or pawns of the United States in an effort to delegitimize them. And President Trump, with the travel ban and the efforts to rip up the nuclear agreement, is deeply unpopular in Iran. But President Trump is also following the path that Ronald Reagan followed back in the 1980s, where he's supporting dissidents. That is something that anti-communist activists and opponents said was a huge support during the 1980s in places like the Soviet Union and in Poland. That appears to be the method that President Trump is following, and that has a lot of support among American legislators and other politicians here. Whether or not it makes a difference in the protests on the ground in Iran, that still, Heather, remains to be seen.
Yeah, people in Iran, though, saying they expected that nuclear deal would benefit them economically, and now saying they're not seeing those benefits, and we see the protest happening as a result. Thank you. Connor Powell live for us. We appreciate it.